Good evening. I am Lawrence Khan, Chair of the South Wales Jewish Rep Council. I would like to welcome everyone online to these Jewish community hustings for the Senedd elections 2021. Before I introduce tonight's event, I'd like to say a few words about the manifesto itself. The Welsh Jewish community is proud of the manifesto for Wales in both Welsh and English. My two Welsh grandchildren, 10 and 8, are completely bilingual and attend a Welsh school. They're often asked for their help with the Welsh language programs, explaining and supporting Jewish festivals and holy days, produced by S4C in Welsh. Jewish people are proud to be Welsh and pleased to support their local interfaith communities and business enterprise. Before and after the Second World War, Jewish refugees from all over Europe escaped by various means and were welcomed by the government to Wales, in particular the Treforest trading estate, to pass on their knowledge and manufacturing expertise. We have until recently felt very comfortable and happy in Wales. Unfortunately, the recent rise in anti-Semitism, disguised as anti-Israel prejudice, has caused serious concerns as to our future in Wales through ignorance and prejudice. We are confident that recent political changes and a greater knowledge of Judaism is contributing to what we hope will be a more secure future. We trust our manifesto will make for a greater understanding and enable us to live in peace and harmony in future. I'd like to thank all of Wales' major political parties who've sent candidates to these hustings, and in particular to welcome Sheila Gewolb, Vice President of the Board of Deputies and the Deputy for Cardiff United Synagogue, for chairing this evening. It's my pleasure to hand over to Sheila.
Thank you, Lawrence, and good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here and welcome. 3 years ago, I did this a sort of physical meeting in Cardiff United Synagogue, and it's quite exciting, hopefully, to be able to reach a broader audience this evening through this virtual scenario. So thank you, Lawrence, for that introduction. And I am indeed proud to represent Cardiff United Synagogue on the Board of Deputies. And I'd like to thank Lawrence and all the South Wales Jewish Rep Council for their work together with the board. I'm really pleased to be part of this. I'm passionate for my work on the board, supporting Cardiff, and delighted to welcome people here, as Lawrence says, from the 4 major political parties to these hustings. So we have a great lineup for you tonight. Members of the Jewish community, I have no doubt, will be familiar with our panelists, but I'm delighted to introduce you to them in alphabetical order this evening. Thank you. So first of all, we have Councillor Rodney Berman, OBE. Rodney is the Liberal Democrat candidate for Cardiff Central. He was first elected to Cardiff City Council in 1999 and in the Plaid Newydd ward, and led the council for 8 years between 2004 and 2012. Thank you, Rodney. Good evening.
Evening.
Secondly, we have Andrew R.T. Davies, leader of the Welsh Conservatives.
Good evening.
Good evening. Andrew is leader of the opposition in the outgoing Senedd, and he represents South Wales Central and was leader of the Conservatives in the Senedd from 2011 to 2018. And he resumed that role in January of this year. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Third, we have Vaughan Gething, a familiar face. I know, I'm sure we all know him well. Minister for Health and Social Services. Vaughan represents Cardiff South and Penarth and was previously the youngest ever president of the Welsh TUC. So, hi. And last but not least, we have Liz Saville Roberts. Liz is the MP and Plaid Cymru's Senedd campaign manager. She is also the leader of Plaid Cymru in the House of Commons, where she represents Dwyfor Meirionnydd. So good evening to all of you. And it's lovely to have you, Prananda, yeah? Prananda? I only learned a little bit of Welsh. Born in Cardiff, but Welsh was something I acquired much later on in my life. It was just a smattering. So, you know, good. Diolch. I'm to remind you, please, to keep your answers to 2 minutes. And the running order in which you answer, I shall keep rotating the people in the order in which they speak. I hope that's okay. So, okay, so we will have the questions will come up on the screen as I read them out to you. I hope that's okay. So as everybody can see what the questions are. So first of all, we're going to look at anti-Semitism and party culture. Can you all please give an example where your political party has gone wrong on anti-Semitism in the past? And what will you do to counter this situation going forward? So if we start, please, first of all, with Rodney. Thank you.
Well, I think the issue here sometimes is that parties could act quicker when one of their own representatives perhaps says something untoward, says something that doesn't represent the party's values. And certainly we've had these experiences within the Liberal Democrats, not that I can particularly recall within Wales, but I know at a parliamentary level, sometimes we've had MPs who, well, I can think of a couple of occasions over, you know, going back over the last maybe 20, 30 years or whatever. And I think, you know, in both cases, I think we're probably talking about people who are no longer particularly welcome in the party, would be standing for the party again. But I think it's always a tricky issue when somebody who is one of your elected representatives said something a bit untoward. So what I would like to see is a sort of commitment that if things are said by an elected representative that is just not acceptable and doesn't represent the party's values, you know, that the party does act swiftly and deals with that in all cases. And, you know, as somebody who myself was born and brought up in the Glasgow Jewish community, although I've lived in Cardiff for about 27 years, so I'm pretty much an adopted Welshman now, I'd like to think. But I have suffered, you know, experiences of anti-Semitism used against me. I think the worst was during a council debate when my administration was likened to being like the Nazis, which was something that a councillor said and then wouldn't subsequently withdraw. And the problem is that councillors and all other elected politicians are community leaders, and they need to be setting a good example. And unless we do set that example, then what we do is we basically give carte blanche to other people to behave in a prejudiced and unacceptable manner. So we've got to clamp down on something, whoever does it, and whether it's an elected representative or not, I think, you know, at the earliest opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. So can we move now, please, to Andrew?
Thank you, Sheila. I'd like to look on the positive and what we've done as a party to recognise anti-Semitism and make sure we sign up to the charter that the Holocaust Remembrance Association has defined as being anti-Semitism. And we signed up to that in 2016. And we've been a very positive party in engaging with the Jewish community and making sure that we try and stamp out anti-Semitism wherever it rears its ugly head. But I do endorse the comments that Rodney touched on there as well, that we're all guilty, I think, as parties of sometimes not reacting quick enough to some of the concerns that are raised. And it is important that parties, both at local government level, parliamentary level, and just membership level, address these concerns head on and are very firm in the actions they take. And sometimes parties can be seen not to be addressing it in one of those quorums. And so we need to be more interacting with the membership, with the elected membership, to make sure that where concerns are highlighted, we do address them. But I do emphasise the point of the Conservative Party signing up to the international definition of anti-Semitism and having that as a core principle since 2016.
Thank you. Vaughan?
Thank you. The question about can you identify an example of where your party has gone wrong on anti-Semitism, and it's a matter of common ground that my party at a UK level has had a significant failing on anti-Semitism, and the party here in Wales hasn't been immune from that. It's a matter of real shame that the Labour Party was investigated by the Human Rights Commission, and the report that was published was accepted by the new leadership with an action plan to combat anti-Semitism. But it should never have come to that. We should never have been in a position where my party, for all of the disagreements we'll have between parties over the past and in the future, I think has had a pretty proud record of being on the wrong side of fighting for equality. We've absolutely been on the wrong side of this. It was a failure at leadership level. It was a failure to recognise the importance of the issue. It was a choice by some people in the previous leadership to see this as an attempt to smear the leadership in a factional fight, rather than recognising there are people who are in the Labour Party who simply should not have been. And our disciplinary process simply didn't work. We didn't deal with people quickly enough. We didn't deal with people fairly. And it was seen as looking after your own rather than just doing the right thing. And in Wales, we've had members who have gone down that same path as well. There are members who've been disciplined. There are members I'd rather not see in the party. And I've been really clear inside the party and externally about what I expect from members and from my party. So, you know, we've suspended a member of our own group, actually, because of comments that she made that were plain unacceptable. So we've undertaken training through the whole of our group. But I think much of this just really isn't difficult. When the Welsh Government signed up to the full IRHA definition on anti-Semitism, that should have been a clear signal for all of us. And I just don't think it's difficult to see a way to disagree with the current government of Israel, whoever it is, but not to fall in to the sort of anti-Semitism that we have seen on the rise right across the United Kingdom. So it's more that all parties reset our own expectations of ourselves and each other. And I think my party still has some way to travel before we're in a position to call out what other people are doing, because we need to put our own house in order first.
Thank you. Thank you. Just have to move on. Thank you. Liz, we'll come to you now, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila.
Thank you. Thank you, Vaughan. Yeah.
My party, Plaid Cymru, received in recent years a number of complaints related to anti-Semitism, and the party leader, Adam Price, felt that we needed to look at this as a party initially. I think it is important that parties endeavour to put their own affairs in order, being aware that we could also, of course, have the Equalities Human Rights Commission investigating individual parties, as they have done with Labour, as I believe they're considering doing with Islamophobia with the Tory party. But in the first instance, what I came up against was some of the matters that have already been raised. The tendency within parties to look for the root of least resistance, and really having to put our own party in order. Amongst that, I am having thought through our own anti-Semitism statement, which had the Home Affairs Select Committee clauses in relation to intent, rather than the full IHRA statement. My recommendation is that we should adopt the full IHRA statement, because we need to disentangle intent from a statement or rhetoric or conduct that is anti-Semitic. It either is or it isn't anti-Semitic in relation to that which is experienced by the person on the receiving end. Intent matters, but it matters in terms of sanctions and what follows on. I think that, so that recognising intent, recognising the Macpherson principle, recognising the need to develop training, particularly in relation to social media, and particularly in relation to people who are new into politics, very much so. Also, the need to maintain considered, what's the right word now? The discussions that we hold regularly with the Jewish community in Wales, because fundamentally, if we are a party, and I hope and aspire that I really hope that we are a party that welcomes anybody into Wales in all variation and all diversity, then we have to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And it's really important that we hold these conversations with the Jewish community in Wales. I had a conversation on Friday, and I look forward to moving forward in that spirit of co-working together for greater community cohesion.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all four of you. So we're going to move on now and talk about inclusive society. So next week, the Board of Deputies of British Jews launches its commission on racial inclusivity, looking to see how, as a community, we can be looking to see how we as a community can be a place where Jews of colour enjoy safety and equality. What can the Welsh Government do to ensure a pluralistic and cohesive Wales, where all ethnic and minority communities are safe and equal? And this time I'm going to come to you first, Andrew.
Well, it's about working as a government with all sections of society to make sure that there's that inclusive and cohesive feel across the whole of Wales. I represent, as you said in your opening remarks, Sheila, South Wales Central, which most probably is the most diverse community you'll find anywhere in Wales, and I take great pride in that. And we as a government would introduce a strategic race equality plan to guide all Welsh Government thinking and actions so that all bodies are joined up in what they want to achieve, is that cohesion and pluralistic society that we need in 21st century Wales. It is a fact that sadly there was an 11% increase in racial hate crimes in the last recording period. Up to 78,000 race crimes were reported. That's a slur on our society, and we must get on top of that, and we must take leadership and offer role models to show that there's a way out of this. Thankfully, there was a 3% decrease in religious hate crime, which is a welcome decrease in that particular area. But when you're talking about 11% in racial hate crime, we can see the scale of the challenge that we face. And it is about making sure that there's opportunity to go forward in whatever walk of life you're in whatever society you're in, and you feel part of that society. You're not pushed to the margins of that society. And that's through education, that's through economic opportunity, and that's through health outcomes as well. And so working to create this race equality plan to guide the principles of the Welsh Government would be the key benchmark of our success at the end of the 5-year period that this Assembly Parliament term will run for.
Thank you. Thank you. Vaughan?
We have a range of building blocks to start from in creating a more inclusive Wales, and particularly when it comes to equality and the role of race and religion, and a broader acceptance and understanding of what it brings to the country and how it enriches all of us. So you'll recall that some time ago, when Rodney Morgan was the First Minister, the creation of an interfaith forum. And actually that work between faiths across Wales, I think, has been really valuable. And I know members of the Jewish community regularly take part in that. And I think when there have been times of difficulty, that's been important in bringing people together. We're also investing in community cohesion and looking to address some of the challenges that we know exist, especially with challenges on the far right of politics, outside any of the parties who are represented here today. And that's a real threat to all of us. We already have a race equality plan that we've published to implement through the next term. Now, the challenge there is about doing the right things to make sure there's a real difference that's made. Some of that comes at earlier parts of life, and I'm very proud of the new curriculum we have, which is about teaching how Wales gains from being a pluralistic, open and inclusive country, but is honest about sometimes our difficult past as well. The main thing I think the Welsh Government can do is to say that this matters in what we do. It is about leadership, the choices we make, the sort of country that we want to be. When you're in government, you can say a great deal about who you are and what you want to be, and equally not making sure we don't fall into the divisive rhetoric we see from some parts of the world, and sometimes within other parts of the UK as well. So the example of leadership, the example of action to go alongside it.
Thank you. Thank you. Liz?
Thank you. I mean, firstly, just to point to something in policy that Plaid Cymru would enshrine the basic rights of the citizens of Wales in a written charter of citizens' rights and responsibilities, which is a concrete, if you like, constitutional way ahead that would embrace inclusion and diversity. But the one thing, and I've been looking at the Commission for Race and Ethnic Disparities that was commissioned by Number 10 and, of course, in Westminster, and I do find some concern that there's an inclination to blame individuals for the situations in which they find themselves and saying that everything within society as a whole is fine. And I think that certainly one of the things that many of us in Wales and politics aspire to is to address deprivation and inequality across the board. And that actually is one of the ways that we will find a more cohesive society. Now, interesting with the race and the hate crimes, actually quite an interesting measure. The fact that people are more prepared to come forward and record these is in of itself interesting. And I wondered if we were to devolve policing, that we could actually have more coherent policies that we could track this across Wales more effectively. I really agree with what Vaughan says about history. I think that we need to recognise that there are different histories, people from different backgrounds, and that we find a way of respecting all of those and not expecting history just to be one cadr and one canon of accepted truths.
Thank you. Thank you. Rodney?
Well, I think ultimately it's about leadership, setting an example from the top and showing that, you have a government that fully embraces equality. I mean, I am a liberal, because equality is utterly important to me, and valuing everybody as being of equal importance, and valuing difference. And that to me is something that drives me politically. I think it drives my party, and you know, if we are in influence, I think, you know, we would want to make sure that we live by that standard. And you know, I think you've got to have dialogue with people. That is very important. I think Vaughan talked about that, because you've got to understand people's real life experience, what it is like perhaps to be the victim of racism or homophobia or anti-Semitism. And I think, you know, you talked early on about the experiences perhaps of Jewish people, who are also people of colour. As a Jewish person who's also from the LGBT community, I also know what it's like when you feel that you're coming from two different minorities at the same time. And what you've got to do is make sure that you lead absolutely by example. So I too am pleased about the new curriculum that has been brought in Wales by the outgoing Welsh Liberal Democrat Education Minister, Kirsty Williams. And I think part of that is about making sure that we do promote tolerance, and that we do make sure that we teach people the appropriate values, and live by those values and govern by those values. And we do have to speak out when things are wrong. We do have to have dialogue with people from all different communities. And we need to make sure that we're required legislation in place that underpins equality at all times. And if there are cases where we need to revise legislation, then absolutely we should look at that. And we should make sure that we are sending out a message that everybody in Wales, regardless of their background, regardless of their racial background, their religious background, their beliefs, is equally valued.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So now one or two of you have mentioned about education and, respecting diversity and all faiths. And a subject very close to my heart is education. And our next question looks at that. So the Welsh Government recently included non-faith elements in the religious studies module of the curriculum. Mm-hmm. There are concerns that this would leave the Welsh pupils knowing less about faiths and faith communities, creating a space where prejudice can grow. What would your party do to ensure such education is not watered down? Come first of all this time to Vaughan, please.
Yeah, I know this is referring to the replacement for RE with religion, values and ethics in the new curriculum. And I understand where the concern comes from. I understand that people don't want to see the role of religion downplayed in both society for those people with faith, but also the broader point about everyone understanding each other's faith and how and where people come from. I think that's really important in understanding who the country has been and who we are today. And I think part of this is, with respect, I think that the challenge in landing the new curriculum is understanding the ethos and the point behind it. Understanding how everyone, because this will be a statutory part of the curriculum, everyone will have to learn about this. You won't be able to opt out of this. And I think that's a real strength. You'll have to learn about lots of different faiths. And I think people will be richer for it. And it is then about going back to one of our earlier questions about how do you help to create a more pluralistic, open and welcoming Wales. And I think the curriculum is absolutely part of that. The challenge is that if we go back to what we had, where there was protected time for specific subjects, you end up with a real spaghetti soup that became unmanageable for actually teaching a curriculum where you'd see people in their whole context. I actually think the new curriculum that we've just passed, and I was very proud to vote for, and I've been very pleased to work alongside Kirsty Williams as a minister in the government, will actually put us in a better place to teach people about difference, to respect that difference, and the major role that faith has in people's lives in Wales today, including, of course, people of the Jewish faith and community as well. So I think we're in a better place as a result of the curriculum that was just passed.
Thank you. Thank you. Liz.
I used to be a portfolio holder for education in Gwynedd, and I was also a director in Group Llanrwllon Menai, which is one of the largest FE institutions in the United Kingdom, and certainly the largest in Wales. It is evident to me that we need to make sure that the religious education element is still there, because the risk is otherwise that it will disappear. And I think looking at the new curriculum from outside, because obviously I haven't been teaching for 6 years or so now, one of the things that I always know is really important is the way in which we give teachers the means to develop their their own classroom activities. And I would hope, and this is a really broad brush statement just because I've got the opportunity to do it with Vaughan Gething here, and I don't normally get this opportunity, is that realizing how to actually bring about change in education, it's absolutely essential to give teachers the time to think and to talk. And the fact that we are holding these sorts of conversations, it's not necessarily the case that we will have the changes that we hope to bring about just by saying it on this is on syllabus or on a piece of documentation. We really need to find a way of making sure that we're measuring the quality of what's going on in the classrooms. And I would think that on sensitive matters, and I get the desire to talk about ethics and morality as well here, because these are all matters that are tied together. But I'm really interested in seeing how we measure the success of this in the future. And because we know that anti-Semitism is one of the charged matters in our community, it would seem to be one of those matters that we need to keep an eye on. We don't want RE taught as a dry, abstract subject. This is about how people succeed in living together.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll come to you next, please, Rodney.
I think we do have to recognise that Wales is a very diverse society, and that includes people of religious faith and people who don't have religious faith, and people who are brought up in different backgrounds. And therefore, I don't share the fear that's implied in the question that somehow this will be a watering down. I think it's about teaching people to value different beliefs, across all of those people who are here in Wales. And, I think, on a personal level, I'm thinking back to when I was at primary school, albeit that was in Scotland, because I'm from Glasgow originally. And I think I was the only Jewish child in my class. And every time the class went to the school assembly, I was left in the classroom on my own. And basically just left to my own devices, and that's because my parents didn't want me to be taking part in singing hymns, etc. But that didn't teach me anything. So I think we've moved a million miles on from that if we are now looking at some kind of religious education or I appreciate it's not quite called that, but some kind of system in the curriculum that allows us to teach all people about all different beliefs, all different faiths, and being able to value each other. And I think that is absolutely the way forward. And I don't think that there really should be any concern. If there is a concern, then obviously we can review at a later stage and we can look to refine. But I think that what has been put in place by the Welsh Government is a model that I'm incredibly comfortable with. And as I say, a million times better than the model I experienced when I was at school.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrew, please. Thank you.
This was one of the areas that I had concerns with over the new national curriculum. I did vote for the national curriculum because I thought the overall gain was of overall benefit to pupils when the curriculum kicks in schools. But I think it goes back to some of the earlier questioning around race and integration. Very often, sadly, religious conviction is part and parcel of some of the persecution that's going on. And it's through the education system that hopefully we can create that understanding, that plurality of the communities that make up Wales. And so it does rely on the ability for the education system to provide that space for faith to be taught in a meaningful way, and people can understand the many different faiths that we have here in Wales, and understand how important it is to people, whether they are the Jewish faith, whether they're the Christian faith, Roman Catholics, Muslims, right across the board, Hindus, so that we understand the tapestry that is modern Wales, because that's what hopefully the national curriculum will achieve. It will achieve moving Wales into an education setting that ultimately reflects where we are in the 21st century, rather than based on what was maybe devised in the later part of the 20th century. But I do think the comments that Liz made about being able to measure that and measure the outcomes are really important, because it's not just saying that they just sit on a piece of paper because we've passed a piece of legislation. It's about making sure that the school curriculum can have that space to educate and respect the values that the different faiths have in Wales. Otherwise, if we don't, then we will have failed. And so our manifesto, which is launched tomorrow, covers many specific areas around faith schools and their role within the education system, transport to faith schools in particular, and the support that we would give to that. And so hopefully that mix that we have gone for will support the retention of faith education within our system.
Thank you. Can I say at this point, we're halfway through. We've had 3 of our 6 questions, and I want to thank you all for keeping to the time. It's not easy to get everything you want to say over in 2 minutes, okay? And I really appreciate your support with the timekeeping. So now we're going to talk about Israel. So proposed boycotts of Israel seek to mirror the conflict rather than support a peaceful resolution between Israelis and Palestinians. There have been calls for Welsh public bodies to boycott Israel. Will you oppose such boycotts? I'm coming first to you, Liz.
Thank you, Sheila. Yeah. When writing the anti-Semitism review for Plaid Cymru, I think one of the things that I learned from this was a far better understanding of how many Jewish people have family in Israel, so that when you're talking about criticism of Israel, people will take this personally, because they could be talking about their nephews or their nieces or their cousins, and also that there's compulsory conscription as well. It made me approach this question in a different way. I think also that it's really important for those of us who are within the political sphere to appreciate that the IRA anti-Semitism definition does allow, obviously, it recognizes the need to be able to hold the Israeli government to account in the same way as you would hold any other similar government to account as well. So it's finding a way of making comment when the Israeli government acts in a certain way which would be held to be unacceptable in relation to other governments as well. I think the other thing that I took out of writing the review was how much more complicated the political situation is in Israel than I had ever appreciated, and that there are many different ways of discussing the politics of what is happening in Israel and the politics of what's happening between Israel and Palestine and the politics of what's happening in Palestine. So to come down to answer the question now, if the actions are similar in relation to the Israeli government, the political response is to criticize the Israeli government, and it is that which would be used against another government. In terms on a governmental state level, that could be sanctions. Then those are one of the options that are possible in the political route. At the same time, however, and one of the things that I hope that Plaid Cymru will work with in the future, certainly that I will aspire to, is the sense that awareness that when certain things come into the public domain, the threat that Jewish people feel in Wales increases, because they'll be brought into the sphere of this. So for all of us as politicians, we need to act as leaders and be aware of the effect of what the things that we may be saying lightly can affect other people, and that we have a role in assuring peace for all communities here and for a peaceful resolution between Israel and Palestine.
Thank you. Rodney.
Well, I don't think boycotts in this context are always particularly helpful, and I think Liz did touch upon the impact that can have on people. I mean, I have family, not hugely close family, but I do have family living out in Israel. My father, my late father, he went out there on a volunteer scheme at one point, and my aunt and uncle went out there and worked in a kibbutz when they were young and things like that. So I think people have to understand the importance and the value that having a Jewish homeland can mean to Jewish people, and particularly with the experience that older people from the community went through, through the Second World War, through the Holocaust, etc. And I grew up with plenty of people around me, friends and relatives who had escaped persecution. Some had been in camps, etc. And it was very much real to me. And I suppose that the issue here is that when you talk about people wanting to sort of boycott a nation because or boycott trade because of the actions of a government they don't agree with. I mean, I find I regularly disagree with the actions of the Israeli government, but when you get into the realms where effectively it can make people feel that they're not particularly welcome in their own country because they feel it's an attack, I suppose, on their identity to a certain extent, it does cause issues. So from my perspective, in this context, I wouldn't support such boycotts. I think what we need to do is promote dialogue. We need to find sort of peaceful ways of getting resolution of dealing with long entrenched issues.
Thank you. Andrew.
No, I don't support the boycott of Israel on the premise that many of the boycotts are promoted just because the Jewish state exists. And I think that's reprehensible, to be honest with you. I do think that we can look at the strong relationships that Britain and the State of Israel have had and enjoyed. Obviously, there are conflicts and tensions within the Middle East that obviously are ongoing and do need resolution. But many of the boycotts that I see promoted, in fact, there's a campaign going on at the moment, seem to be embedded on the fact that the State of Israel merely exists. And I think that's reprehensible. So no, I don't support those type of boycotts.
Thank you. Vaughan.
No, I don't think a boycott approach to Israel is going to be effective, either in helping to achieve a different outcome in terms of relations between Palestine and Israel, or indeed to recognise, as both Rodney and Liz have said, that actually this broad brush campaign and the way it's promoted often seems like trying to punish the whole of Israel, and you get into collective punishment rather than actually looking at what you want to achieve. And frankly, if the State of Israel is going to have people promoting campaigns against, there's a lot of the rest of the world with significant human rights issues that we don't talk about in the same way. The rush for deals with China, with the way that the Uyghur people have been treated, I think there's a much more direct issue right in front of us in the here and now. And actually, from the Welsh Government point of view, the government I'm still part of, obviously, until people decide what to do in the coming weeks, we don't have a boycott policy as far as the State of Israel is concerned. We're looking to have in procurement a statement of values for every part of the world and not to try to single out individual countries, because I think that gets to be really difficult. It's a highly contested area, open to misinterpretation, as Andrew has said, open to people whose real objective in this is prejudice, not promoting legitimate trade between different parts of the world. And of course, the awkward questions about human rights are in more than one part of our existence, including with long-standing allies.
Thank you. Thank you. Moving on now to refugees. The plight of refugees is particularly close to the hearts of members of the Jewish community, as many families have stories of parents and grandparents who, quote, just got out in time. What can the Senedd and local authorities do to support refugees seeking asylum in this country? Come first of all to Rodney, please.
Well, it's about making sure that you do have a welcoming approach. I mean, I appreciate that immigration policy is not within the gift of the Senedd or in local authorities, but I think, having a welcoming approach, and that's something that can be led, by the Senedd, can be led by local authorities. And I was certainly involved in such projects when I was leader of Cardiff Council. And we did, a lot of work on making sure that Cardiff was seen as a place that was welcoming to people of all backgrounds. And I very much understand, the stories that people within the Jewish community will have, because, I remember my grandmother telling me very much about her father came over at the turn of the 20th century, fleeing the pogroms in Russia, and he turned up, couldn't speak a word of English, and just had a sign round his neck with an address on it, which he pointed to when he came off the boat. And fortunately, some kind person got him on a train, and he managed to get to where a relative who'd already come across was. And when you hear stories like that, you realise, well, I am grateful that the country was welcoming when he came over, and when my other great grandparents came over, because they mostly came from Russia and the Baltic states. And I also think, I'm lucky that they came here and didn't end up in some other parts of Western Europe where, things might have been different when we went through the Holocaust. And therefore, it is utterly important that at all times, governments, local authorities, whatever, send out a very strong message that they're not going to have, any truck with people who are not welcoming, people coming in from other backgrounds, and that you lead by example, and that you maybe put in projects that help communities work together and help sort of overcome differences between communities and understanding between different communities.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, I thought it was particularly important when Lawrence opened the meeting earlier today, and he made the point how Wales historically had been very welcoming to especially Jewish refugees coming into Wales, and the positive contribution that they've made to communities the length and breadth of Wales. And he obviously highlighted how in recent years they haven't felt that necessary security that maybe previous generations had. And I do think that we need to be a welcoming country when it comes to refugees. We do need to offer those opportunities because Wales has a proud tradition in that respect, and the Welsh Government, whoever forms that after May the 6th, will have an important role in leading that welcome and that ability to provide opportunities, whether that be access to public services, whether that be economic opportunities, or importantly in the field of education, that whole education experience so people can contribute positively to their life where they've settled. And I do think what's really important is that from the very top question that we had about anti-Semitism in the Jewish community, people feel confident that the politicians they have in place are signed up to the protocols and the understanding of what they need to undertake to make sure that in the Jewish faith, the community feels safe and secure. And we go back to that environment that Lawrence touched on, the previous refugees who come into Wales and contributed so positively to the fabric of Wales can resume that place within our Welsh society.
Thank you. Vaughan?
Yeah, look, I'm very proud of the fact that the Welsh Government has set out with Welsh Labour leadership and support from people across the political spectrum for Wales to be a nation of sanctuary, where we do welcome refugees and we want those people to be treated fairly and decently. And it's part of the story of Jewish peoples through time, but many others as well, in terms of moving out to escape persecution and needing to start again. They have another faith community. When I go and celebrate Diwali, as I regularly do, or have done until this last year, many of those people who are celebrating Diwali in South Wales are actually people who are forced to flee Idi Amin in the 70s. So actually you recognise that our country has benefited a great deal from people who have been displaced, and it's the welcome that those people have had that has been so important for them to feel safe and settled. I'm afraid, though, we see lots of the rhetoric currently is very unkind, is divisive, in particular the way it's often pointed at people who are Muslims, people who are like me as well. So you've got this challenge of a much more unkind rhetoric. And we saw lots of that in Penally as well. And I have to say, I don't often have sympathy for Simon Hart, who's the Welsh Secretary and a Conservative Member of Parliament, but that camp in his constituency was created by the Home Office and he found out about it as it was happening. So there was a policy challenge there with a lot less kind rhetoric in terms of refugees. They're being demonised. And at the same time, those people weren't supported to come here to be successful. And the Welsh institutions around the local authority and others in the health service weren't properly aware of what was happening. It's an area we really do need to work more properly together, the Welsh Government and local authority and the NHS here in Wales, to support people properly together with the UK Government, but also to support communities who are receiving people as well. So they're not dropped into an unwelcome situation where people are often frightened about what they don't know and understand, and there are people who are professionally setting out to take advantage of that and whip up fear. This is going to be a continuing challenge for us because the world around us is very unstable, and refugees are a fact of life and will be for some time to come, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Thank you. Liz?
If I could just mention one particular refugee who I think has had some influence in Wales. It was Kurt Hahn, who came from Germany in 1933, and he set up Gordonston, of course, which is where Prince Philip was educated. And Kurt Hahn went on to establish the first Outward Bound Centre, which is in Aberdyfi in South Gwynedd. And that then led on to the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, which we've also been discussing much recently. But the other big influence he had on Wales, of course, is that he was one of the founding fathers of the Atlantic College, and also where the International Baccalaureate was first taught, which had its influence in the Welsh Bac as well. So I think that's a really interesting just piece running along in our history now. Now, to look at what we're doing at present, I am proud of my own party's record in the Plaid Cymru run Ceredigion, which takes in more refugees, I think, than any other local authority. It's 10 per every 10,000 of population. And I was also involved in the appalling events, actually, in Penally, to which Vaughan has already referred. We did put a lot of pressure on to make sure that actually the independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration visited, and his inspection was frankly damning. I think he was due to retire, and he was determined to retire, having said what needed to be said about that place, because it was not COVID fit. It was just taken over with no planning control whatsoever. It was an example of the Home Office just being able to walk in and use ex-army accommodation that was entirely unsuitable for purpose, and in a community that was desperately ill-equipped to deal with this, and the far-right protests that followed in its footsteps. And just to close, of course, my party also aspires for Wales to be a nation of sanctuary, and I think as part of that, again, to be able to do this job properly, we saw the Home Office being able to come in and do what it liked here, regardless of the costs and the effect on the local police and crime commissioner, regardless on the effect on education, on the effect on health, that could be imposed upon us. We need to have the immigration powers devolved to avoid these sort of situations, and also to make sure that actually our immigration needs are put first for Wales' particular needs.
Thank you. Thank you. So we come to our final question now, everybody. Wow, it's been a bit of a marathon, but again, thank you for the timekeeping. It's been, Daniel from the Board of Deputies has been sort of, keeping me on track, but he hasn't needed to, because you've been amazing. And I really want to thank you before we go into the last question. This is about religious freedoms. So the Senedd has legislated on matters which do not just impact on the Welsh Jewish community, but can be replicated across the United Kingdom, such as the new organ donation regime, which is one reason why protecting religious freedom in Wales is important for the whole UK community. Will you pledge to defend the right of the community to continue to slaughter animals for its own use according to its own traditions? I'm going to come first to you, Andrew, for this last question. Thank you.
Well, I'm a farmer.
Andrew, thank you.
Sorry, first of all, I could put my thanks on the record to the Board of Deputies for hosting tonight's presentation and Hustings. It's been really enjoyable, especially to interact in this format. But on the specifics of the question, as a farmer, so long as these things are undertaken, obviously, in licensed abattoirs under supervision, then yes, I would be defending the right for this tradition to continue, because I think it's an important part of the Jewish faith and understanding. And I do believe that we should be respectful of faith and tradition, so long as it's done obviously under supervision and under the correct procedures. And I think that's an important caveat when you're talking about this particular aspect.
Thank you. Vaughan.
Oh, yes, interesting. My father, my late father, he was a vet, and he ended up being a meat inspector later in his life as well. And so he was always, one of the things that drove him in the work that he did was he absolutely, he loved animals. And animal welfare standards, including on the way to slaughter, was something he was very, very exercised by. But this is the point about having welfare standards that I don't think are incompatible with traditional forms of slaughter. And so it's, I often disagree with Andrew R.T. Davies, but on this I broadly don't, because actually I think there's a challenge about making sure that we have the right standards in place. We've got a commitment to have CCTV in slaughterhouses to make sure those standards can be monitored properly, and to make sure that we can understand the difference, but also the things that we share together as well. So I don't think that animal welfare standards are incompatible with the questioner. On the broader point about religious freedom, lots of our discussion today has been about tolerance and acceptance of difference, and I think this is part of it. When I look forward to, in the future, in whatever all the people of Wales decide for me, to continue my engagement with the Board of Deputies in my constituency role, or whatever else people may decide afterwards. And thank you very much for a very interesting and constructive evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Liz.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sheila. Yeah, I for lack of any qualifications whatsoever, but I am an honorary member of the British Veterinary Association. And I think it's very interesting to have a proper conversation about how we can maintain animal welfare and with traditional slaughter methods as well. And I know that with halal as well as kosher, that these are not incompatible. And at the same time, animal welfare can be hijacked by certain interests that use this as a route, a rabbit hole, if you like, to take the conversation away from the point at hand. So it is perfectly possible, again, in the real world of politics, where we actually have to discuss how people get on and do more complicated matters, it's perfectly possible to manage that. The one thing that I would like to just bring up in my close, and one thing I don't think we've discussed enough in part actually, is the relationship between the development of the Welsh language, the renovation, the reinvigoration of the Welsh language, and the reinvigoration of Hebrew. So that's one of the things that I say, that looking back in Gwynedd, and again the work that I did previously in language development, if I could just give a quick plug to Joshua Fishman, who has been one of my inspirations when it comes to community language planning. That, of course, also been put into effect in Israel as well. So there are things sometimes we need to remind ourselves, but we do have an awful lot in common. And if we can find time to talk about that as well as our concerns, that I think would be really, really useful.
Thank you. Thank you. And Rodney.
Well, can I also thank the organisers for the opportunity to take part in tonight's hustings, and I think you've raised some very interesting issues and very important topics, and it's been nice to take part in this dialogue. I think this probably is a question where none of us are disagreeing, because I think what the others have said is exactly what I would say, is that provided everything is done in accordance with current regulations, then absolutely fine. And I think as others have said already, we don't think that the current standards are incompatible with the traditional slaughter methods, and it's probably just as well, because the number of Friday night dinners that I had when I was growing up, so I probably consumed quite a considerable quantity of kosher meat over the years, but on a serious point, this is an issue where standards are important, but as long as things are done in a regulated manner, and I fully believe that they can be done and be compatible, then that's absolutely what we should continue to do.
Thank you. Thank you for those insights. So we do have a few minutes here, and I'm not going to let you off the hook quite so easily, because we do have a bonus question. It sounds like, something you've earned, from Professor Nathan Abrahams from Bangor University. Nathan's question is: higher education in Wales has been decimated over the last decade. How will your party ensure the future of the Welsh universities by funding them properly? So I'll go right back to the beginning, and I'll start first with Andrew.
Right back a bit. Oh, sorry. Well, it's making sure that there's equality of access into higher education, and above all, the Welsh Government makes sure that we're compatible with our funding levels of other parts of the United Kingdom, and importantly, getting research into our universities, which is really important, which historically we haven't attracted the right levels of research funding that can support the activities of HE. I mean, I myself didn't go to higher education university. My daughter was the first person in our family to come out of Aberystwyth University with a degree. One of those proudest moments of my life as a father, obviously standing at her graduation ceremony. So it's really important that we support, obviously, our higher education sector that can be so important to the economics of the country as well, because I was at a factory this morning visiting, and they were saying about the importance of their relationship with Swansea University in developing battery technology and cell technology. And if we want an economy that can fire into the 21st century, it's making sure that we get that research funding out of the UK pot to support the universities. But above all, we're attractive to bringing in students to make sure that the student numbers going through the universities who pay the fees can make sure that the universities can compete on an international level as well as a domestic level. So tomorrow we'll be announcing our manifesto. That will have our commitment to the HE sector, which will have funding levels agreed in it that hopefully will put a robust action plan over the next 5 years to make sure that the HE sector feels that when they look at a Conservative manifesto, they can see the way forward to supporting their continued development and their importance in the economic prospects of 21st century Wales.
Thank you. Vaughan.
Well, Andrew's right that HE is an important economic sector, as well as the point about the learning and the knowledge that we get beyond that. And there is a challenge about how research funding is allocated across the UK. There's, in particular, in life sciences, there's a real bias towards Oxbridge that isn't necessarily borne out by the fact that there aren't appropriate research institutions you could and should invest in there. There's a challenge, and we recognise that in our recent science strategy, needing to get more out of that UK pot, but that does require some UK decision-making processes to look more broadly across the whole of the UK. When it comes to the, if you like, the regular funding for higher education, we've been in a very difficult position since the significant changes made to fees. In Wales, we decided not to load as much debt onto our students. So we've still got the most progressive form of student funding and support within the United Kingdom. That does mean, though, there's a balance in how we provide income into the university sector. And it's been a really difficult time, actually, through the pandemic, but actually for the last 10 years, because austerity has been a real challenge for us. And we're still dealing with the consequences of that decade of austerity. And one of the challenges post-pandemic with recovery is a further honest re-examination of what we're going to be prepared to invest in with the public funds that we do have and what our expectation is of that. The continuing balance between the student, who is now effectively a consumer and the money that they are putting into their education. That may not be all the answer that the questioner wants, but I don't think I should make up on the top of my head an answer about how much money is going to come in, because this is an ongoing conversation that is inextricably linked to the way that our student funding support system works as well.
Thank you. And as I say, I appreciate this being thrown at you, but it's good to have, the audience being able to ask questions, I think is really important as well. So Liz.
Well, I have to reiterate the level of funding that goes to the Golden Triangle, which is Oxford and Cambridge and South East London. We know that is disproportionate to that which is allocated to universities outside that area. And it would, with any government that's looking at a levelling up agenda, really needs to look at that seriously, because universities are the seed for this, not just with the people who attend them, but also the regions in which they lie. And at the same time, we know that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has promised 17 billion further cuts in public sector spending. So how these things quite align, again, in the levelling up agenda, not the short-term money that's going to be just thrown out politically and competitively to different regions, but in the long term, how we're really going to make a difference. I think that will affect universities as much. We're going to have to look in Wales as to how universities are the drivers within some of the more difficult to reach areas, and Bangor, that's a really significant university for the Northwest Wales. I sincerely hope that we will be getting a medical school there, because that is one of the things that we desperately need for the staff to be actually in place. We haven't had mental health services for children in the two Northwest counties for the last 2 years. Finally, I really have to make a play, and forgive me with this, Nathan, but also for vocational education, because that's the background that I came out of. And if we're looking into the future, the skills that we need for young people in the future, we may not be able to offer them in the ways that we're used to. The sort of things that our colleges may offer may not actually be the skills that we need in future. So we're going to think really creatively about how we get some of those skills in places where they're not already available. I'm thinking about sort of the STEM skills. And finally, across public sector education, it's the arts and the cultural side that is suffering across the UK. It's almost become a class divide on who can learn to play music and who can learn to appreciate poetry. That is something that I'm sure that we will continue to resist in Wales, because culture to us is part of our heritage and part of our future. I really hope that we can aspire to education that is as fantastic as it used to be, because we can do it.
Thank you. And finally, Rodney.
Well, it is an interesting debate, and I think Vaughan was right in the fact that the level of funding isn't unrelated to the level of financial support that we have chosen in Wales to provide to students. And I'm particularly proud of what Kirsty Williams has brought in terms of a very progressive funding system, whereby virtually all students can access maintenance grants within Wales. And yes, that does mean that there may be some implications. So we maybe have to look overall at what the funding is for the HE sector. But I think the points that were made about research are ones that I very much relate to. I moved to Cardiff initially to take up a research post within what is now Cardiff University. It was separately as the School of Medicine in those days. And one of the reasons why I came out of research, well, partly because I got elected onto the local council, but also partly because we struggled to get renewed funding within the department I was working in. And this problem whereby so much of the funding does go to Oxbridge and to London is a huge issue that needs to be grappled, and it really, I think, does need to be grappled by the UK government. It's perhaps difficult for the Welsh government to be able to address this in isolation, and I think that is something that we do need to look at in this country, and we do need to look at having a much more level playing field where we do ensure that the investment is going in to HE institutions properly and appropriately, including within Wales. I'm very aware, living in Cardiff, how much Cardiff depends on being a university city, and we've got to bolster that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you again, everybody, for that extra question. Before I hand over to our president, Marie van der Zil, to give a vote of thanks to you all, I just want to remark that this week we actually had, talking about universities, Professor Nathan Abrams was actually part of a discussion round table called by Lord John Mann to look at anti-Semitism and the adoption of the IRA in universities, and the education surrounding that is actually really lacking. So we're going to be working together with Jewish societies and universities, and hopefully with government government help to ensure that universities understand IRA and adopt it. Okay, so I just want to put that plug in because that meeting only happened a few days ago. So Marie, welcome to our amazing discussion, to our panelists. Thank you so much. I'm sure everybody watching has been thoroughly engaged and really interested in your responses to all these questions this evening. So Marie, over to you, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank our spokesman this evening. You've been brilliant. Andrew, Liz, Rodney and Vaughan, just mentioning you in alphabetical order. And I realise that campaigning is a very, very busy time. And I really want to thank you for the time that you've taken to be with us tonight. Sheila, I'd like to thank you for your incomparable comparing. You've been absolutely brilliant, and the Hustings are just the latest example of us working together with the South Wales Jewish Representative Council, whether that's on the manifesto, Devolved Matters, promoting the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Could I also please give a hearty thanks to Lawrence Khan and everyone else at the Rep Council for all of your hard and dedicated work. I'm really proud of the work that we do together to ensure that Welsh Jews have a voice, and this is something that the board is very committed to. And I want to thank all of you who've been watching and will be watching the recording. Politics is not a spectator sport, but something we must all be involved in as a Jewish citizen and as citizens of this country. And you've been so involved tonight. So thank you, everyone. And on behalf of the Board of Deputies, I wish you all a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's why.